Today marks exactly 5 years since the Fukushima nuclear plant disaster, one of the worst of its kind in history. It kicked off with an earthquake, which prompted a 49-foot tsunami hitting the plant. Fukushima was not prepared. Its wall could only have protected itself against a tsunami half that size, and all safety systems failed. The chain of events led to at least 3 explosions at reactors, emitting huge doses of radiation. And to this day, we still do not know the full extent of the damage. RT's Alexei Yarashevsky breaks down the series of events from that day 5 years ago to where we stand today.
Friday, March 11, 2011, 14 minutes to 3 p.m., a 9.0 magnitude earthquake strikes off the coast of Honshu Island at a depth of about 15 miles. The Fukushima Daiichi plant's reactors 1, 2, and 3 automatically shut down due to tremor, as they should. 6 minutes later, Reactor 1's emergency cooling system turns on automatically. But in 11 minutes, workers at the plant manually shut it down. The system did not need electric power to cycle steam through a cold water, but operators soon noticed that the cooling of the core was happening too quickly, which could have stressed its steel walls. So they switched it off. Basically, it was a by-the-book decision. The problem is the book was not written for what happened on the 11th of March. 3:27 p.m., while tsunami alert was glaring on all screens at the station, the first wave struck the plant, followed by another one 19 minutes later. A humongous 46-feet tsunami overtopped the seawall at the plant, which had only been designed to protect the station from 19-feet waves. The facility was inundated, backup diesel generators disabled, all safety systems failed. It was later revealed in an investigation that some of those systems had not been tested in over 40 years. 6 p.m., the core temperature starts climbing, and an hour later, a nuclear emergency was declared by Tokyo, but the Japanese government said that no radioactive leaks detected, probably trying to comfort the nation, but was later accused of a cover-up because of that. 27 minutes later, the fuel in Reactor 1 became fully exposed and damage started building up in the central core. 9 p.m., an evacuation order was issued by the government, bewildering to this day as to why they only decided to evacuate people within the radius of 2 miles from the Fukushima Daiichi. Those within a radius of 6 miles were told that they could remain in their homes, and that's happened while the TEPCO company announced that the pressure inside Reactor Unit 1 of Fukushima Daiichi was more than twice the normal levels. In the next 4 days, 3 consecutive explosions occurred. On March 12, the Unit 1, on March 14, Reactor 3 building, and on March 15, Reactor 2 building, elevating the Fukushima accident to one of the world's nuclear disasters in history. Direct consequences for the world are still debated, but for Japan itself, it meant that 99,000 of Fukushima residents have been displaced as of January 2016. The total number of people displaced by the tsunami and radiation makes up 174,000, and those still living in temporary government housing amount to more than 60,000 people.
Incredible numbers. Well, we have team coverage of this anniversary with RT's Alexei Yarashevsky and Alex Mihailovich. Both of you have done countless stories on this disaster in the past 5 years. Alexei, I want to start with you. You were on the ground at Fukushima just 2 years ago. What did you see when you were on the ground, and what surprised you most years after this disaster took place?
Well, scenes of absolute desolation, very reminiscent of that in the Chernobyl exclusion area in Ukraine. Empty houses, empty streets. It seems like the time has stopped there, which is shocking. But the most mind-blowing thing which I experienced in Japan was that when I was there 2.5 years ago, the Japanese government allowed the people to relocate back into the area, which was like about 10 kilometers or 7 miles from the nuclear power plant, which doesn't even meet the international standards of having a 30-kilometer or rather 22-mile radius around the station. The worst thing about it is that there are towns 60 kilometers, 45 miles from the Fukushima Daiichi plant, like the town of Koriyama, where the radiation levels are still high and people are living there. I made a report back then, which I'm personally proud of. I think it's one of the best things I've ever done. And let's have a look at a snippet of that report now.
It's hard to say what gives you a creepier feeling, the trail of destruction left by the 2011 tsunami, or the houses untouched by natural disaster but abandoned after the nuclear accident. Walking through the deserted streets of the Fukushima exclusion zone, we can see plenty of both.
Technically, we're now well within the Fukushima no-go zone. We're just 10 kilometers from the nuclear power station. These houses, ravaged by the tsunami in 2011, still stand here nowhere near to being restored. You'll be surprised to learn that radiation levels here are in fact lower than in some of the European cities.
Radiated material from personal belongings to contaminated soil is put in plastic bags and buried. The radiation meter went berserk even from a considerable distance. Imagine our surprise when we found similar levels in an area which had never been included in the no-go zone.
I've traveled to the Chernobyl exclusion zone more than a dozen times, and this was probably the scariest episode when we put a radiation meter on the ground on a layer of moss, and it produced more than 800 microrontgens per hour. That is 40 times more than the normal human radiation level. Here, 60 kilometers from the Fukushima nuclear power plant. The readings are certainly less than that. This is close to the average level of the ghost town of Pripyat in the Chernobyl zone. Only with one exception. The place where I'm at right now, more than 10,000 people are currently living.
In her short life, this girl has already got used to seeing a lot of radiation meters. Her mother joined an NGO group of ordinary women, united by fear for the future of their children and distrust of the government's actions.
We're sending our data to government and TEPCO officials every day, and we get no reply. Don't see any action from them. As if they're trying to play down the scale of things. Meanwhile, our children are already suffering from thyroid issues.
Anti-nuclear protesters in Tokyo say no one should be allowed back into the Fukushima area until it's completely safe, which in truth may not happen for centuries.
You know, when the actual Fukushima story broke, I covered it from Kiev, being the bureau chief in Ukraine back then, and the similarities to Chernobyl were striking. Not only those two events were put level 7 nuclear incident by the International Atomic Energy Agency, but also the government cover-up. Chernobyl, 1986, the Soviet government hid it basically from the world and from its own people. 2011, the Japanese government in the supposedly democratic Japan does the same with its own people. So this is one similarity, which is the most incredible one. And again, to this day, we don't know the exact consequences of both the Chernobyl and Fukushima. This is something that the world is debating actively.
It's incredible, those images, not only that, but the fact that we were able to have you on the ground, too, doing that reporting. Thank you so much, Alexei. Alex, I want to turn over to you now. In Toronto, Alexei had mentioned Chernobyl. You know, there are only 2 disasters, Chernobyl and Fukushima, that are rated at a 7 on the max, which is the max of a nuclear event scale. Now, the Japanese government estimates that the radioactivity released from Fukushima disaster was just 1/10 that of Chernobyl. So, Alex, why do you still say that Fukushima is worse?
Well, look, we've heard a lot from the Japanese government, but more importantly, we haven't heard a lot. They've tried to hide this from day one. We know last year there was groundwater spewing into the Pacific Ocean that they somehow forgot to tell the public about. And this is happening over and over again. And there's just one thing I want to interject here for a moment. It's unbelievable how little media coverage this is getting 5 years down the road, or how little media coverage it's gotten in the past 5 years. We're dealing with a nuclear disaster where you still have groundwater pouring into the Pacific Ocean. It was 350,000 tons a day. Over 700,000 tons of radioactive water has gone into the Pacific Ocean. Now we have these containment facilities. There's 1,000 of them just outside or in Fukushima that are taking most of the water in, but it's still going into the ocean. And the ocean is a massive thing. We all know that. But our food supply is within that ocean. And people will say, well, you know, around Fukushima, they're not harvesting fish from there. Well, fish migrate. So, I mean, this is not an excuse. You know, personally, I haven't eaten Pacific fish in 5 years. Maybe 5 years from now, I will try again. It's just one of those things. The risk is too high, and it just takes one fish to become sick. So any way you turn it, this disaster in itself is something that is more widespread. The Pacific Ocean touches so many millions, if not billions of people, unlike Chernobyl. Now, Chernobyl was horrible. To this day, if you go to Eastern Germany, they'll tell you do not eat the truffles from East Germany, do not eat the wild boars who eat the truffles because of the contamination that still exists. Wow. And for sure, I mean, it's an awful thing, but looking at Fukushima, at how massive this disaster really is and how widespread it is. It was even detected in Iceland in rain after Fukushima, the radioactivity. So, I mean, how can you compare the two? I mean, they're both massive, but this isn't over. That's the whole thing. We won't be able to compare it for another 5 to 10 years. Then we'll know the full effects and how many people are actually going to die of cancer from this thing, if we ever know at all, because everybody's trying to hide it.
Right. Well, you know, 5 years later, they are still trying to clean it up. I know that they have a seawall, but they can't confirm that there's still not leaking happening. 5 years later, there's an ice wall that's supposed to be stopping it from leaking into the groundwater. That itself has not, they just finished building it, so a lot to be done here. Real quick, Alex, does what happened in Fukushima mean anything for the nuclear power industry in general? Is what we know, is it going to change anything?
Look, the nuclear power industry makes up 14% of all energy on the face of this planet. We can get rid of it tomorrow, and we should. Every nuclear scientist that I've spoken to, the people that work at these power plants, has told me when a disaster happens, they don't know what the heck to do, and we've seen that twice. We don't need to see that again. There's hundreds upon hundreds of plants around this world that need to be shut down. I know that here in Canada, I've talked to a nuclear engineer who worked on the East Coast at a plant that was never functional. That thing costs $1 million a day to run. To build a new plant costs about $10 billion. We don't need nuclear energy. There's plenty more places that we can get energy, and we should be doing that, looking at alternatives.
RT correspondents Alex Mihailovich in Toronto, Alexei Arashevsky right here in Washington. Thank you both for your diligent reporting on this.